But we never did get to talk about Jimmy Butler, who, he had some scathing comments about the Heat and how this situation might be untenable and not fixable, and he wants to be traded. And the Heat ended up suspending him for 7 games. And Pat Riley is a very intense individual. So, and Jimmy Butler is like, it's like the unmovable force meets the,
Yeah, meets
you
it.
know,
Or Jimmy's the unstoppable force, and
yeah.
Riley's the immovable object.
But he is due back for the Nuggets game that's coming up soon. So that's,
Yeah, I'm very curious to see if the Jimmy that the Nuggets get is saboteur Jimmy, who is pissed off that Pat Riley can't won't trade him slash find a trade with him. I will say, there were reports coming out that multiple teams had been told not to trade for Jimmy Butler, like probably by his agent. And it just kind of reminded me of the Dame situation a couple summers ago, where the same thing was happening, and his agent was making public comments about like where Dame wanted to be and like all of that stuff. And they ended up getting fined by the league. So I was like, didn't we literally just go through this? Like, that's not allowed. It also makes it more difficult for, like, it doesn't really help Jimmy to do that because it makes it more difficult for the Heat to find a trading partner for him. Obviously, he's doing it because he's trying to get one particular destination in the Suns, but the Heat do not want Bradley Beal's contract. And the Suns would likely have to give up uh, first round draft capital to move that contract to a third team, for example. It's just like a whole mess. And really, like, this is like the Dame saga. It's just another sort of tick in the column for the difference that we're seeing now in the level of power that players have over like where they go and like trade packages and all of that stuff now with the new CBA. And it's not like there are any like explicit restrictions on things that players and agents could do before, besides literally like the public comments like I just talked about. It's just that teams are so much more strapped now that all the things they used to do sort of extra just to like keep players happy, like let me extend this guy a year early to keep him happy, and like give him a player option to keep him happy, trade him where he wants to be to keep him happy. The calculus is different now because the penalties for a a bad contract on your books or an unproductive player, all that stuff is just worse now than it was before. It's more onerous. So you're weighing like keeping certain players happy a lot less against these other consequences. It's definitely an interesting sort of economy in the NBA in that sense.
yeah, I wonder how much the owners were like cognizant of what the effect would be of the CBA to kind of undercut some of the players' power to like demand where they want to go in these situations because it was a lot easier early, before all this.
And this kind
But
of goes along with one of the thoughts that I've had about the new CBA and like which classes of players are most affected. I don't actually think the like middle group of players is that negatively impacted because of, like, we've talked about this in the past on the show. Like, there are definitely like middle to higher level role players that just have a bigger market because those guys just are more valuable when there's like more parity. Any like margin that you can get matters more. So you see guys like KCP getting paid, Bruce Brown getting paid, and maybe that's just my bias because I'm viewing this through the lens of a Nuggets fan and like us not being able to afford these guys anymore. But the groups of players that are affected are definitely like older vets, in particular on the like that minimum end of the scale, because you have all these like younger rookie contract guys that teams are trying to like basically replace the older vets with. Um, who were made cheaper by this new CBA because of some of the rules around like you can give longer term contracts to like second round guys and like things like that. but also guys at the upper end who just don't have quite as much flexibility and quite as much of a market because their contracts are so big. And so if you're not a franchise guy, basically like a 1A, the guys who never move anyway because Shea's not going anywhere, Jokic isn't going anywhere, Luka's not going anywhere, Giannis for now isn't going anywhere. But if you're like those like 1Bs and like number 2 guys that they know can't be the best player on a team, um, it doesn't always mean that you won't get paid. Because in the case of we talked about Jamal Murray all summer, he had to wait all summer to get extended in a situation where in the past that would have been just a no-brainer extension at some point earlier in the summer in a previous iteration of the CBA. Brandon Ingram hasn't been extended by the New Orleans Pelicans, and they've been trying to move him forever because they don't want to extend him to a max contract. Paul George, he gets paid, but he doesn't get to stay on the team that he wants to be on in the location that he wants to be at in the LA Clippers because they don't want to pay him. So he ends up having to go to Philadelphia to get that money. And now we've seen in not sequential summers, but we saw with Dame 2 summers ago wanting to move. He doesn't get to go to the place that he wants to be because of the not just because of the size of his contract, because Portland is trying to get the best deal for him. Whether or not they actually got it, I think it's actually pretty debatable. Uh, Based on like what they got from like the Drew swap ultimately versus what maybe Miami was offering. Uh, but they didn't want to be bullied by the Miami Heat and like sent Dame wherever and Dame, frankly, because his representation was sort of in some kind of indirect collusion to try to get Dame there, and that didn't work. And now the Heat don't want to be bullied by Jimmy Butler and send him somewhere that's going to result in them taking on a bad contract onto their books. So it's it's a really interesting shift in the power dynamic, not just with the players, but like agents have less power too, right? Um, and I think that is also interesting because certain agents and agencies have had a lot of power and a lot of influence and kind of they've built teams before. Like you could say the New York Knicks were built by CAA, like the current iteration of the New York Knicks, especially after Carl Anthony Towns goes there and Julius Randle, I believe, left CAA was the middle of last season to his new agency. I forget which one he's with right now. So that's interesting, which is why news like I don't even know if we talked about it on the show, but both Zion and Brandon Ingram left their respective agencies within like a week of each other. Not to go to a new one, but it was just like, oh, that's interesting. Is it like, especially for guys that are not Zion, but like Brandon's up for extension, and you'd think like, did you leave your agency? Did your agency fire you, especially like when you're in a contract year, like that's big money that could come their way too. There's a lot of like weird money dynamics that are involved in the background of all of this stuff. And I think that that's another layer of what was perhaps um, inspiring the restrictions of the CBAs. You know, these billionaire owners never like getting pushed around by anybody because they're egomaniacs, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to end up, but yeah, it's just harder when there's less teams that have even a realistic path to adding players like this. And it's just like
yeah,
so many less options. And I think in recent years, people have talked about how like teams draft capital to be able to use in trades is just drying up. Like so many of it's been just like sent other places. And so you don't even have that to incentivize
yeah.
teams to take on
Because all
contracts. And you
draft
have,
capital's concentrated in, like, 4 teams.
yeah,
It's like
yeah, exactly.
well, New York before the Mikal Bridges trade, now I feel like the Nets are starting to amass, like, a tiny little cache of picks. Obviously, OKC, like, they have the biggest stash, and the Jazz,
The
I think the
Rockets have a ton of
Rockets,
the Suns.
and the Spurs.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
In
yeah,
OKC still, of
yeah,
course.
for
So,
sure.
uh, yeah, it's part, and it reminds me. We don't have to go into this now. We can talk about it later on, but like, it does remind me a bit of. Obviously, I'm focused on the Nuggets reality, and like they have all these big contracts, and who knows what'll happen this trade deadline or even in the summer. But it's just so much harder with bigger contracts, and got to be very careful about what those big contracts are. I wonder if in a couple of years we'll start to see more tiered like contracts of some kind where it's like truly those 1As that you're talking about have massive ones. Obviously, it's going to take many years because a lot of these players have like super long contracts. So, and I don't know when we'll start seeing teams being like, well, you're not really at that level, so we're going to get you down a little bit more with what we're offering you. But I feel like teams are going to have to do that because of how restricted this salary is and stuff like that. So who knows how that'll
Yeah.
shape out. But
And the thing is, like, not just Supermax, but other, like, just the not designated veteran, but just veteran maxes are a creation of the CBA. Like, those are written into the CBA, what that percentage is. So, like, that slightly lower than like the upper echelon tier is like written into the CBA, but maybe there needs to be like another
I
one
know,
that can be like,
yeah,
we recognize that you're like a really good player, but you're not quite like a 1A or even like a reliable number two. Um, and there are like lots of guys in the league that would probably be recognized as being sort of that level. But when you start doing that, you also put a little bit more power in the players' hands because you make it so that more teams can afford them. Part of why even supermax contracts exist, and you'll recall they didn't exist when Kevin Durant went to Golden State, because if they did, OKC would have been able to pay Kevin Durant a supermax and nobody else would have been able to. So that's like another thing. Like that was partially created to keep franchise stars with their team, with their like sometimes smaller market teams. So there's a push and pull there. With, so it's not just about like, oh, if teams could pay players less, like they'll just automatically have more power. Not necessarily, because that means that lots more teams can afford that player like at that price point, so the player can be like, oh well, I mean, I like this location better, or like this like playing situation a little bit better, things like that. um like if I'm not going to be getting like that top tier money, then there are other considerations that come into play, and that's always the the like you think about it on the micro scale with the Nuggets, because we have all these players that are not all of them, but like a bunch of players that have player options. So you're just like, why does this guy have a player option? and it's like, I guess nobody wants to come to Denver. But then I look at smaller market teams like the Pacers or even the Timberwolves, and I'm like, these guys don't all have a bunch of player options. So like, what are we doing here? There's no way that like Denver nightlife is that much worse than Minneapolis like nightlife.
yeah. Especially playing
But
with Jokic. I mean, come on, he's got to be a
I
attractive
know.
destination. But we'll get more into the trade deadline as it gets closer. I am someone who wants to see fun, explosive trades. Like, I just think it's fun, but we're seeing less of that. And all the speculation around trades to, I don't know what word you want to use, devolves or evolves into this conversation about contracts, which I don't know how many people care about. That's an interesting topic in itself, is how much
Yeah,
fans
that's
care
true.
about this kind of stuff versus like, I just want to see this guy traded to my team. That's not as fun
I
as an
wonder
NBA
I
fan.
I wonder if it would be a like, I feel like NFL fans care about this stuff, and I think they care about it more because the NFL has a hard cap and has, to my knowledge, always had been a hard cap situation. So these conversations have always been like crucial to team building. Whereas now we have kind of like a soft hard cap in the second apron in the NBA, and it's a newer development. And fans have it always been able to sort of like, dream up all of these like free flowing trades for the most part, to kind of dream up. And now there's a bunch of stuff that just doesn't work. Whereas I feel like maybe in a few years, like that'll just be part of it once it becomes more like normal in
Yeah,
terms of
could
like the
be.
discourse with like, yeah, I feel like casual NFL fans talk about contract sizes and stuff like that all the time, and like why certain things work and certain things don't. At least from my like outside observation, because I'm not really like a big football fan, but it seems like that is like an ever present actually part of the conversation about roster building, especially, I mean, we don't have to get into this like too much, but yeah, I've been watching the NFL playoffs that started this weekend, and it felt like a lot of the conversation about like some of the teams that like didn't make the playoffs or that did but got eliminated this weekend. immediately goes to like, okay, what are the parts of your team that you want to prioritize? Like maybe you've got like a really good rookie quarterback and you're not paying him a ton of money, so you can put more money into your offensive line, or you can put money into your special teams or your defensive units and things like that. But you can't spend everywhere, and that's just the fact that you can't spend everywhere and make everything good is just like known, like it's just a baseline. So they talk about like what should we emphasize here, but that's not the case when it comes to NBA discourse necessarily, and I think part of that's because it's been so easy in the past. And I don't follow baseball at all, and I know you've got like baseball muted on your Twitter and things like that, but they like don't have salary caps.
Yeah, I
So
don't know
it's
anything
literally
about that.
just like four teams that everybody talks about that can afford to just do everything. And so that's like a completely different situation too. Um, yeah, I think it's interesting, and I wonder if people will find it interesting in the future. Other people. Yeah.
Well, hopefully some fun stuff happens and we'll see some new teams or exciting combinations of players, maybe even on the Nuggets. You never know. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for spending time with us. If you're new, please consider subscribing. If you're a lurker and you haven't subscribed yet, consider finally hitting the subscribe button and helping us out. Hit the like button and the notification button. We need all the support we can get. And if you do that for us, we would love it. And just remember that winning is fun and losing sucks.